שלא אכלנו עליך אמונה, סבנו ואותנו כדבר אדוני.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me for this afternoon's Parashat HaShavuah class. Even though I'm away, I'm hoping we can keep this class going. It's important to, I think, stick with the rhythm and the flow of Parashat HaShavuah. Last week was our first class, and I explained that unfortunately I had chosen the date to start the first class on a week where there was no Parashat HaShavuah because of Passover. Passover took a break from the regular cycle of Torah readings. And even though it's still Pesach this week, still this coming Shabbat, we will resume the Torah reading cycle. So this Shabbat, we're reading Parashat Shemini. And this afternoon, I wanted to offer some thoughts on the Parsha, which is a very important Parsha in the Torah. It's important because this was supposed to be the highlight of the wilderness experience. Shemini means 8. And if you know from Hanukkah, the time it takes to the dedication ceremonies of the temple, the time it takes to complete the dedication ceremony of the temple is 8 days. That goes all the way back to this Parsha, Parashat Shemini, where the tabernacle was supposed to be inaugurated on the 8th day. I'm sorry, it was inaugurated on the 8th day. That's the name of the Parsha, Parashat Shemini. But if you're familiar with the Parsha, and maybe this week you can take a look at some of the events that happened during the Parsha, this great moment of climax of the whole wilderness experience, the dedication of the tabernacle, turns into a terrible, terrible day where Aaron's 2 sons, who are named Nadav and Avihu, are consumed by a fire from the Lord. It is not clear what exactly they did to deserve being killed in that way. The Torah doesn't really say that much about it. It says they offered a strange offering to the Lord, and I could give this whole class just on different rationales for the deaths of Nadav and Avihu. Some say they were drunk. Some say they were not following protocol. And when you're serving in the temple, you have to be very careful to follow protocol exactly as you're supposed to. For the purpose of this class, let's just take it for granted that there was some terrible punishment of death to Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's sons, and that this great day of joy and celebration turns into a day of destruction and mourning. I want to talk about Moses and Aaron's interactions, 2 interactions following this terrible tragedy. Remember, these are Aaron's 2 sons, so it's Moses's nephews who were killed. And the 2 brothers, Moses and Aaron, have 2 interactions following their deaths. And I want to speak about just a little bit about those. I'm also aware that this week we're reading the Parsha during a week where 2 sisters were terribly, terribly killed. And actually, I just found out today that their mother died too. They were murdered by a Palestinian terrorist just a couple of days ago. I believe the family's name is the D family. They lived in Efrat in Israel. And I got to see a little bit of the funeral, which was just a heartbreaking funeral because their mother was not present. And then I heard she passed away earlier today. She was also attacked by the shooter, but she was able to survive at least another day before ultimately succumbing to her injuries. But it's hard not to be conscious of the parallel between the Parsha and current events, right? It's almost freaky. We're reading this week of the death of two brothers and the reaction of their father and their uncle. And at the funeral, the father and the uncle of these two girls who were killed, both sobbing together over the terrible tragedy that happened to them. How do we react to tragedies like this? How is it even possible to go on? How is it possible to logically make sense of events like these that happen in your life that just prevent you from building things back together again the way they used to be? Here we have, I think, in our Parsha, a very different style of dealing with loss and grief between the two brothers, between Moses and Aaron. When the death happens, the Torah records a conversation between Moses and Aaron, where Moses says, this is what God meant when God said, Bikrovai Akadesh, through my holy ones I shall be sanctified. Moses, in other words, is turning to his brother and trying to offer him, I wish I could say consolation, but it's sort of a strange consolation. It's not really being in tune with Aaron's feelings. It's almost Moses giving an explanation, saying, look, you are a priest, your children are high priests. It means the stakes are high and you're very close to God, and the rewards will be very great. The fame is very great. The position you have in the community is very great, but with greatness comes great responsibility. And your children, for one reason or another, did not live up to their responsibilities, and so they meet this terrible fate. Bikrovai Akadesh, through my holy ones I shall be sanctified. And what does Aaron answer? Two words that almost they haunt you in the Parsha. The Torah says, Vayidom Aharon. There actually are not two words. Vayidom Aharon means Aaron was silent. It's not just that Aaron was silent, right? The Torah could have just ended the dialogue after Moses says, Bikrovai Akadesh, right? Move on to next chapter. The Torah explicitly notes, Vayidom Aharon. Doesn't end the dialogue before saying explicitly, Aaron was silent. You see already two very different reactions to this tragedy. And you could say, as some have said, well, Moses is heartless. How could he jump so quickly to offer an explanation? And you could say of Aaron that this loss to him was so personal. I mean, it's not fair to compare the reactions of an uncle and a father. Obviously, the reaction of a father is going to be much more intense. So maybe Aaron is justified in just being silent and not saying anything. Today, as you know, there's still a custom in Shiva houses. You are not allowed to speak to a mourner unless the mourner speaks to you. It's an acknowledgement that silence is a very necessary and healthy way of coping with a death, particularly a tragic death like this. The Torah accepts Aaron's silence, and Moses, we don't know what his reaction is. He tries to engage his brother, but the timing is not right. The same thing happens just a few verses later in another dialogue the Torah records between Moses and Aaron on the day when the sacrifices are supposed to be offered in the temple by Aaron's other two sons and by him, right? The two sons who survived. They were supposed to offer a sacrifice and partake of the sacrifice and not allow it to burn on the altar. But reading through the Parsha, we see that Aaron and his sons do not eat of that sacrifice. Rather, they're sitting and mourning still because of what had happened to their brothers and and their sons, right? Aaron and his sons and the two brothers. And just like, by the way, there's a custom in funeral homes to be silent, not in funeral homes, in Shiva homes to be silent. There's also a custom that many follow in Shiva houses to not eat meat. Maybe this all goes back to Parashat Shemini, to our story, not eating meat and being silent. Aaron and his two sons don't eat of the sacrifice, and Moses gave them explicit direction to partake of it. So Moses is a little bit upset. He turns to his two nephews and to his brother and says, hello, I gave you explicit instructions. You were supposed to be eating of this sacrifice, not allowing it to just burn on the altar. Now here, Aaron and his sons are not silent. They respond to Moses and they say, this is a tragic day for us. We're in mourning. Can you give us a bit of a break? It's not the exact words from the Hebrew, but I think it's the appropriate tone that I imagine them using to Moses when Moses makes this, asks this question of them. Can you give us a break? How can we eat meat? Our two brothers just died. Can you leave us alone? And actually the Torah then says Moses accepts their response. Whereas the first time Moses's answer in the first dialogue, we don't know what Moses's answer is. Maybe Moses and Aaron sort of never resolve their differences in that first conversation. At least here we know in the second conversation that it's resolved. Moses accepts the fact that his brother and his nephews are in mourning and they shouldn't be punished or scolded for not listening to their instruction, to Moses's instructions to eat of the sacrifice. There's an interesting question I ask you all to think about. Was Moses in mourning? Was he heartless? What was he trying to say to Aaron? Would you say it was the wrong words at the wrong time? Or does Moses have a different way? And this is what I would submit to you. Does Moses have a different way of dealing with grief than his brother? That is, it's not insensitivity that brings Moses to say, come on, get back to work. You had your tragedy, too bad. I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about it, but we've got to get back to the work of sanctifying the tabernacle. Is that coming from Moses's insensitivity? Or is Moses dealing with his grief by almost quickly putting this tragedy behind him and jumping forward to his next task? I will tell you that as much as maybe some of you feel like Moses was insensitive, I have seen as a rabbi those two different personalities in the ways that they cope, in the way that people cope with terrible tragedies. I have seen the one who cannot move forward, the one who is silent, the one who doesn't want to sort of enjoy life anymore because he or she would feel guilty. I've seen that person before, that Aaron. But I've also seen the Moses reaction. And I've seen it even from fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers. The one who wants to jump back into life quickly, who wants to put the tragedy behind them, who doesn't want to dwell on it, who wants to ask himself, what do I have to do? And then once they've done what they've had to do in terms of rituals, they get back to work, get back to life. It does not mean that they are not grieving. but I think the way they handle their grief, I'm not a psychologist with this stuff, but just my observation, is that it is a coping mechanism. Avoidance is a coping mechanism. Moving forward, moving on, not dwelling on the hurt and the pain. That is perhaps Moses's frame of mind. It doesn't mean that it's contemptful or wrong what they're doing. It's just the way that a character like that copes with tragedy. But it's just as healthy, perhaps. So you have two figures, Moses and Aaron. This was a tragedy that happened to both of them, but two very different reactions to that tragedy. Soloveitchik wrote a whole essay about this, whose yahrzeit, I believe, was yesterday. I think Soloveitchik's yahrzeit was yesterday. Distinguishing the man of fate from the man of destiny. He said that Aaron couldn't be compared to a man of fate, someone who believes that what happens to them is meant to be. And maybe that's why he accepts in silence, right? This is another layer beneath Aaron's grief. Not that Aaron rejected Moses's words of consolation. Not that Aaron couldn't face his loss. Aaron was facing it, but the way he was facing it was almost succumbing to his inability, to the chaos of life and his inability to control that chaos. That's one model that Soloveitchik contrasts with another personality that takes what happens to them and then asks the question, what does this teach me? How do I move forward? What lessons can I internalize from this tragedy, from what has happened to me? And let me go forward and rebuild and redo. That's the man, not of fate, but the man of destiny, who takes his destiny into his own hands, so to speak, and says, I won't just accept what has happened to me and give up, but I take what has happened to me as a lesson and move forward in light of what I have learned. And that, he says, is more Moses's reaction. Moses isn't being insensitive again. Moses is just saying this terrible thing happened, but now what do we do about it? Well, let's dedicate ourselves even more intensely to the work of establishing the sanctuary. And that's why maybe he was a bit tough on his nephews, even while they were in mourning. He was just grieving in a different way, understanding what had happened to them as a family, but Moses himself more, let's say, aware of the lessons that this tragedy had and more encouraged to rebuild after learning those lessons. It's interesting that Parashat Shemini is often read right before Yom HaShavuah, and one can say that the state of Israel, the building of the state of Israel, is a man of destiny, Moses' way of reacting to the tragedy of the Holocaust, right? Moses' way of reacting to that, rather than Aaron's way of just being silent, right? Moses says, what do we do? How can we rebuild? And for some, the lessons of Yom HaShavuah are Jews must never be left powerless again. We need to have a state of awe. And so Yom HaShavuah and Yom HaAtzmaut, one week from each other, that's not a coincidence. According to many, it's because one grows from the other. From the lessons of tragedy, do we understand how we can rebuild? So I look today at this terrible tragedy that has happened to this family in Efrat, the loss of not only two children, but their mother as well. And at the reactions, not just of their father and their remaining siblings, but really the reaction of the whole Jewish world. And I think for myself, I feel the impulses of both Moses and Aaron. I don't know about you, but I feel both of those impulses. The part of Aaron, who is speechless, who looks at the picture of these beautiful girls and cannot believe that they were taken so young at the prime of their lives, with so many of their dreams and aspirations unfulfilled. And I'm just stunned and don't know how to react. On the other hand, that's not sufficient. Jewish people right now face terrible threats in Israel. And to just be stunned and helpless, I know is not sufficient. There's the piece of Moses in me that says, well, we've got to be strong. And we've got to be strong in our resolute in our commitment to defending the land of Israel, to our being resolved against the evil of terrorism. And we have to make sure that this family has everything they need, that they're receiving the comforts of the Jewish people worldwide. We've got to do something. What can I do to help the situation and to make sure that I feel like there's some lesson, there's something that I can do with my grief, with my being stunned, something that's got to grow from it. So this is what I submit to you today. I think you have here two fascinating personalities in the way that they react to tragedy: the Moses model and the Aaron model. And I guess I offer this today to cut Moses some slack, because I think it looks at first glance, if you read the chapter, as I was reading it earlier today, at first glance, it does look like he's being so insensitive. How do you go up to a grieving father and right after he loses his sons, start giving him explanations? I mean, everybody knows when a death happens to you, when a tragedy happens to you, you don't want to hear explanations. You don't need people telling you why. You just want people to be there with you, to be your friend, to be helpful. You don't need theological explanations. So Moses, at first glance, looks like he's not sensitive to that. And certainly in the second part of the story, when he's telling Aaron and his other sons, come on, we got work to do. I'm trying to redeem him and say that I think there is a place in Jewish theology for responses to grief that are about taking its lessons and turning them into action. And actually, in the father's eulogy for these two girls that died in Israel, he mentioned that. He said, I can focus on what I've lost, but I want to focus on what I have and be thankful for what I have and devote myself more intently to the good work that I can do with the blessings that I still have in my life. An incredible, incredible pronouncement of faith and optimism and hope in the future that I'm not sure I would be capable of if I was, God forbid, facing his circumstances. But I think there's a lesson here for all of us, for the Jewish people who have suffered many, many persecutions. Bechol dor vador, right? Omdim aleinu lechalotenu, as we read in the Haggadah. In every generation, there are those who rise up to destroy us. And just as you could be unfair to Moses for his sensitivity, you could also criticize Aaron and say the Jewish way is not to react with helplessness and just with silence and sitting around and being sad. There's a time and a place for that. But ultimately, we have to pick ourselves up, remind ourselves of who we are, the legacy that we carry, the heritage that we possess, and fight for our values and remind ourselves that the holy task that we were given as a people to pursue, that there will be enemies that will come and try and get in our way, but we cannot give up, that we must always remain strong as best as we can be. So I pray that all of us should be strong in the current days that are facing us in Israel and within our own Jewish community as well. Strong and resolute. If there's tragedies that happen, may we all respond with strength, with optimism, with faith. And let's hope that the coming days will bring more peace and less violence, so that we can have a joyful remainder of the holiday. Thank you, everybody. I will see you again next Monday. I appreciate your attendance, and if you have any thoughts or comments, I'd be happy to read them. It just may take me a little while to respond. My email address is jrgrover@gmail.com. Take care. Thanks again, Gail.